And there are a few differences between migrating a production database and migrating a test database. One of the biggest differences is that when you're migrating a test database, downtime isn't really so much of a consideration. It doesn't really matter if it takes all day to migrate that database because your production system is still running. Also, you don't want to disturb the production system to perform the migration for test purposes. So if you're lucky enough to be able to use a copy of your production database in the cloud for testing, you want to make sure that getting that copy doesn't impede your production workload. The other factor about testing is that it's the type of thing you will do over and over again. You might have that classic 3 tiers of testing where you go in dev, QA, and then UAT type of testing. And for each of those, you might want a different copy of your database. So in order for it to be repeatable, we want it to be as simple as possible. It's not like a production migration where you're tolerant of a bit of extra complexity in order to minimize the downtime. So how do we do this? Well, the best tool is probably Data Pump for most cases. If you don't want to interfere with your production system when you're doing a data pump export, it's a good idea to migrate during off-peak hours to perform that export when the production load is not at its heaviest. Because while it won't interfere with your production workload from a functional standpoint, of course, a data pump export will use CPU, it'll use memory. So you want to make sure that that system resources are available for it. When you're migrating from a production system that's active in any way, then you need to set the flashback time or flashback SCN parameter to get a completely consistent export from the first table that's exported to the last. So that's going to be very important as well. Another way to decrease the time needed to migrate to the cloud is to use data pump compression on your dump files. That requires the advanced compression option, and it can give you a really good compression ratio and decrease that amount of network transfer time. If you don't have the advanced compression option, I'll suggest that you look into ZDM, Oracle Zero Downtime Migration. That's a utility that uses compression under the covers, and because we're providing that for you, when you're using ZDM, you don't actually need the compression option. If you're 24/7 and you really don't have that off-peak time available to perform the data pump export, another approach would be to use your standby database. If you have DataGuard configured, we can't actually export from a physical standby, which is a read-only database, because data pump has to create a table to keep track of all the items that it's going to export. But we can export from a snapshot standby, and we'll talk about how to do that in a little bit of detail here. That allows you also to coordinate with database replay by exporting as of a specific SCN and having your database capture from real application testing start at that SCN. We can get a really good start point for both our replay and our export. So let's talk about migrating from a specific SCN or system change number. The reason we would want to export from a standby database is both to offload the load from your production system, you're exporting from the standby, but also to avoid that old snapshot segment too old error. Now, the reason for that error is that when we are performing a consistent export, and you set flashback time or flashback SCN parameters, we have to accumulate undo for the entire duration of the export in order to export as of that specific set of time, because there's other activity going on in the database. So if you have a very large database that could take a few hours to export, that means accumulating undo at a very high transaction rate for those many hours. And if you don't have enough undo retention, that's when the ORA 1555 error comes in. Well, exporting from your standby databases solves all of those issues there. What we could do is we stop our redo apply on the standby database and convert it to a snapshot standby. And then what we can do is we can recover to a specific SCN. And what we would do in that case is coordinate that with the time, if you're using real application testing, that you start your database capture. And that way our database capture on our primary system is coordinated with the point at which we're exporting from our standby. Then we convert to the snapshot standby, and this means it's open read-write at that specific SCN, but nobody's using it. So because nobody is using this database, we don't have to worry about flashback time or flashback SCN. We can just do an export. The database is fully quiesced. We're the only user there. We don't have to worry about people changing tables out from under us. Perform our export, and then we convert back to a physical standby, and it will catch up. So this makes DataGuard and Snapshot Standby a terrific tool for doing your testing and migrating from that standby for testing purposes.